everybody, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Today we are going to do the next installment in our beginner basics series for knitting. So today we're going to learn the purl stitch. Knit and purl. Those are the two foundation stitches for pretty much the entire encyclopedia of knitting. So once you've got knitting and purling down, you can pretty much do anything. This tutorial is going to assume that you already know how to cast on and that you've already tried knitting, so using the knit stitch. We'll put the links for those tutorials in the description box down below if you haven't already, or you can find the entire playlist on our channel homepage. But today we're going to focus on purling, and we're going to make this really cute little washcloth. Washcloth, dishcloth, you're going to use some crafter cotton for it, and it's a good way to practice a stitch, and at the end of the project you've got something useful. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be useful. And you're going to know how to do the purl stitch by the end of this tutorial. So grab some cotton, grab a pair of knitting needles, let's head to the craft table and purl! For today's washcloth sampler project, I'm using a cotton worsted weight yarn. It's a size 4 with 4 ply, pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and I'm using a 5mm pair of knitting needles. So you can use 5.5mm, you can use 4.5mm. The size of your cloth overall will change depending on the size of your knitting needles, but that doesn't really matter because this is just a sampler project so that we can get comfortable using the purl stitch. And once you've got that assembled, we can get going. You want to begin by casting on 25 stitches. You can start with a slip knot. Put that on needle number 1, and you can cast on 25 stitches using whatever method you like best. I'm going to use the knitwise method, and there's a link for this in the description box down below. Once you've cast on 25 stitches, double count, make sure that you've got 25, and this is the number of stitches you should have on your needle at all times. So at the end of every row, you'll still have 25 stitches. You want to gather your stitches as close to the end of your needle as possible, but don't let them slip off. So it's nice if you've cast on and your stitches should be just loose enough that they can move around on your needle, but not so loose that they want to fall off the end. And I like to try and keep a finger there just to sort of keep them from slipping. It also gives me a little bit of control over the sort of the next stitch I'm going to work. Grab knitting needle number 2, and purling is sort of like the mirror image of knitting. You take needle number 2, identify the first loop that you're going to work. This is the one at the end of your needle. Take needle number 2 and slip it in from the top down on the upside of this first needle. So I'm going to show that again. You're going to take needle number 2 and come down through that needle, or through that loop, across the top of your first needle, and it should look something like that. So needle number 2 is sitting on top of needle number 1, and you've come down through that loop. So from the top down, just like that. Now, your yarn should be sitting at the bottom of your knitting needles. You want to keep it to the front. So when you're purling, you want to keep your working yarn to the front of your work. Take your working yarn and carefully wrap it around needle number 2, or the needle that's sitting on the top. So it should look something like this. You've wrapped the yarn around needle number 2. Now you're going to take needle number 2, keep a finger on that slippery little loop there on needle number 1. You're going to try to keep some tension on your working strand and push that needle, or pull it, back and scrape it across needle number 1 so that you can pick up a loop on your second needle, and then carefully take the loop off needle number 1. And that is a purl. Let's do it again. Now that your needles are kind of closer together, you're going to use the tip. So instead of taking the whole needle, take the tip of needle number 2, come down and pick up the next loop, Remember that your yarn should be out front. It's out front of your knitting needles. Wrap it around the second needle so it looks like that. And then carefully scrape it past needle number 1 so that you pick up that loop on your second needle, and then lift the loop off needle number 1. Try to keep control of those little stitches. You don't want them falling off the end of your needle. This is what I like to call the danger zone up here. Let's do that one more time. So your yarn should still be out front, so it's out front of your work. You're going to take needle number 2, take the tip, come from the top through that loop, keeping your needle on top of needle number 1. Take your yarn, wrap it around the top needle, and then you're going to take the tip, push it past the needle so that you pick up that loop, see it there? And then take the old loop and pass it off the end of needle number 1. All right, one more time. Needle number 2, from the top through that loop. Yarn sits on top, wrap it around that loop, or I should say around that needle. Keep some tension on it and push the needle back past needle number 1 to pick up the new loop, and then old loop comes off the top. So if you're comfortable with the knit stitch, you can sort of see how this is the reverse or the mirror image of the knit stitch. We bring the needle from the top down, sitting on top of the second needle. Yarn is kept out front and not behind. We wrap around and push the needle past needle number 1 to the back to pick up that loop, and then, like before, you want to make sure that the old loop comes off the hook. And that is purling. The other way you know that you're purling is that the little bump part of your stitch sits out front. So if you're knitting, this bump part sits behind the needle, but when it's purl, it sits out front. So you've created a stitch and the little bumpity bump part sits right out front, just like that. A couple more here together. Take needle number 2 from the top down through that stitch. Take your yarn, wrap it around the top needle, which is needle number 2. Push the needle past needle number 1 through to the back, pick up a loop, and remove that loop from needle number 1. Top down, so I'm trying to keep my fingers out of the way here. Top down through that needle loop, wrap your yarn, push it back to pick up a loop, and off comes the loop. From the top through, wrap the yarn and push it back to pick up the loop. And that's purling. You can go ahead and finish this row on your own. Nice and easy. Try not to keep your stitches, from obviously falling off the needle, but also don't pull too much on your working yarn. You don't want to tighten up the stitches that are going onto row number 2 or needle number 2. You want to make sure that there's enough give in your stitches that they move around on the needle, because if you make tight stitches, it makes it difficult to continue knitting. So just a little bit of tension, not too much, just enough to keep it from falling off. When you arrive at your last stitch, purl it as normal. It might be a little slippery and difficult to try and hold on to both needles while you work the last stitch, so just don't rush it. And you can put down your first needle. And now it's always good to stop and count. You can untwist your work so that all of your little newly purled stitches sit at the bottom of your knitting needle so it looks nice and tidy, and you have an easier time counting them. You should still have 25 stitches all the way up. And now we're on to row number 2. So this is now the back side of the purling, and you can see that the bumpity bump part isn't showing up on the front. This is the front. There's the bumpity bump part right underneath the loop on the needle. So on the underside, or the wrong side of a purl row, you see the flat bit, or what you would normally see when you're knitting on the right side. But this is purling, so it's sort of the mirror image of knitting. And now we can continue. So everything on what used to be knitting needle number 2 is now knitting needle number 1. So whatever's in your working or your non-working hand, this is needle number 1, and needle number 2 is in your working hand, and we begin all over again. So try to ignore your little short tail. You want to keep that tucked away with a finger if you can. You don't want to accidentally use it. And we begin. Try to keep some control on those loops on the end of your needle. Pick up the first loop by coming from the top down. Yarn is still out in front. Wrap it around the top one. Push the needle back to pick up the loop. So you're coming underneath this loop, right, to the back, and then pull the old loop off the needle. Same thing, top down, on top of the first needle, wrap the yarn, underneath that loop to the back to pick up the new loop, and then off comes the old loop. And that is purling. You can go ahead and continue to purl as many rows as you feel comfortable. Start with 20 rows, and if you feel that that is a good size, you're comfortable with working that stitch, and you like the shape of your little washcloth, then that's enough. If you want to work a few more rows, go right ahead. You can even continue this until you run out of yarn and have yourself a scarf. Go ahead and continue to purl. At the end of every row, count your stitches. You should still have 25. So far, I've worked 20 rows. So I've got a nice little rectangle going, and it looks like another 20 rows would probably give me a decent little square, and that's on a 5mm size needle. This is how you count your rows. As you can see, I've flipped my work, so the little bumpity bump is actually sitting 2 rows below. So there's right underneath the needle is the underside of the stitch. If I turn it around and I look at the right side, there's the bumpity bump part right along the edge of the needle. So this is how you count. Find your cast on row, which is this loop hanging down here. Don't count it. Find the next bump up. So there's the bump sitting right on top of it. That is row number 1. Then there's a little row. If you stretch your work, you see that there's the flat side in between bump rows, right? Because you're working one way and then working back the other way. So every other row, you're going to get the reverse of your stitch. So you've got a bump row, a flat row, a bump row, a flat row, a bump row, a flat row. And that's how you count. So 1 is a bump, 2 is in between, 3 is a bump, 4 is in between, or you can count in 2s. Pick a bump, find the flat spot in between, and count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, and 20, because there's a flat side just underneath my needle. So there is 20 rows. I'm going to continue working until I've done another 20 rows and I have a nice little square. And I'll see you near the end of row 40 so that we can cast off together. I've decided to finish at 35 rows. I think that makes a nice little sized washcloth. It's about just a bit smaller than the size of my hand. And now we're going to cast off. Because this is entirely a purl project, I'm going to show you how to cast off purlwise. It doesn't really matter casting off in this project whether you go knitwise or purlwise, but I thought you might get a kick out of seeing it done using the purl stitch. So to cast off purlwise, we're going to purl the first stitch, we're going to purl the next stitch, and then just like casting off regularly, you're going to take the first stitch you purled, pull it up and over top, taking care not to knock it off the needle, of the second stitch you purled. Purl the next stitch. Try to make these stitches not terribly tight because you want a little bit of play while you pick up and pull over the most recent stitch. So you want a bit of play. So try to keep them kind of loose. Purl the next stitch. Try to keep a handle on those other stitches. Grab the first one, so the one furthest from the end of the needle, and keep a little tension on your yarn. That kind of helps keep control over the one you just purled. And then pull it up and over, taking care not to knock them both off. And there you go. Just purl the next stitch, and then pull the one that you just purled, I should say pull the purled stitch before it up and over top and off the needle. You can work away at purling off, so casting off purlwise, your last row, and I'll catch up with you at the end of this row. When you get up to the last stitch, purl the last stitch from your other needle. You can put that needle down. Take care to pass that first one you did over top of the end. Then grab your scissors, snip your yarn. You can pull up on that loop a little if you want and get your needle out of the way. Then you want to take your tail, pass it through the loop, and pull it nice and tight. There you go. One basic washcloth. And that is how you purl. All you need to do now is weave in your ends. So grab your yarn needle and you can pick a row, and actually maybe we'll do it on this side. I like to pick up all the little bumpity bumps, the back of a stitch or the front of a purl stitch in this case, in one row by always going through the same direction. Thread up the yarn, pull it through, make sure I don't pull anything out of alignment, and then flip it over, skip over, so here's the last little stitch that I brought it through, skip over top of that, and then just work it back through the last few stitches. And if you're using a slipperier yarn, you might want to do this 1 or 2 times to make sure that your tails don't come out with wash. And that's all you need to do to weave in the end. And that's how you purl. Not too difficult, right? And it really is the mirror image of knitting. So you can think of that when you're purling. This is the opposite of knitting, or the mirror image of knitting, the reflection of knitting. And both are really awesome. That's it for today, everybody. For more knitting fun, you can check out the entire playlist on our channel homepage, or for more stuff like charts and tips and tricks and my blog and even some free patterns, you can head over to our website, and the link for that is in the description box down below as well. So we'll see you soon on the Jayda InStitches show, everyone. Remember, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week. Bye!